All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. Charlie Marlow here on the Kenny Wallace YouTube channel. Wanted to talk with all of you, and hopefully you jump in the comments as well. I already see Matthew McDonald in there. I want to discuss this Carl Edwards interview with Dale Earnhardt Jr. on the Dale Jr. download, Dirty Mo Media. It dropped Wednesday morning. So I listened to it last night. This interview is fantastic. If you're a NASCAR fan, if you're a sports fan, if you're just a fan of good conversation, good discussions, just good content, you absolutely have to listen or watch this interview. And by no means am I saying that because here on the Kenny Wallace YouTube channel, we have a partnership with Dirty Mo Media. It is just fantastic. It's one of the best. I mean, it might be one of the best NASCAR. Maybe it's the best NASCAR podcast, singular podcast I've ever heard. I can't remember myself being more into listening to this podcast, and then also once I started listening, just how good it was. For heck, almost 2 hours. That includes the ads and all that. So maybe the Carl Edwards portion was more like 90 minutes or 100 minutes, whatever it was. It's well worth your time. Now, there's so much to talk about when you talk to somebody for over an hour and a half. But obviously, the big news, the big story, and Carl Edwards, he has started to discuss this because he went into the Hall of Fame, so he had his speech. He's done a bunch of media availabilities over the last year, but he hasn't really gotten super in depth like he did in this podcast with Dale Jr. So let's just start with, I think, what is the most interesting part, and that is why Carl Edwards left unexpectedly, suddenly just retiring from NASCAR, and then kind of disappearing before what? Was it last year, year before? It was the year before with the NASCAR's 75 greatest drivers that Carl Edwards started to reappear at the tracks. That was Darlington, what? A couple years ago. But you kind of wondered what exactly was Carl Edwards going to say, right? Because I also think deep down, there's a lot of things Carl Edwards wants to say that he won't say. And even at a point in this interview, he said, I don't know how honest I want to be about all this. And Dale Jr. also did a really good job of kind of, I don't want to say pressing him, but following up. And it was two buddies. It was two buddies talking. It was a therapy session. I'm telling you, me saying this, I have no financial incentive to say this, but you should absolutely watch or listen to this interview. And I listened to it on podcast. I kind of wish I would have watched it here on YouTube just because I do think the facial expressions matter, and maybe how long it takes for him to say something, or if you can tell he's saying something but he's holding back a little bit. So anyway, he discussed his final race, obviously, there at Homestead. And he did use the words, I can't remember the exact sentence, but he did say that was snatched from him, that championship was snatched from him. And he used that verbiage after Dale Jr. followed up, because Carl Edwards' story, which I believe, but I do think I think he was holding back a little bit just because he doesn't want to absolutely destroy NASCAR, right? He did criticize NASCAR a bit, saying, look, we know it's a fact, and that he talked to people that NASCAR back then, they were throwing those debris cautions to re-rack the field to make things more interesting at the end of a race. And he said, look, that's a fact. He also got into this story where he was talking about his faith and how he was always basically an atheist. And he said just something happened that weekend where his motorhome broke down a couple times. He almost wrecked. And then everything that happened with that final with that final caution, with losing the championship. So he never won a championship, obviously. He kind of framed it like that God had a different plan for him, right? Like that this is how it was all supposed to go. And this is also coming what? We're what now 8, 9 years later. But he did say again that he felt like the championship was snatched from him. And when I was listening to this, look, I do think NASCAR deserves a lot of criticism for this. And they have been criticized a lot for this. This was 8, 9 years ago. They're not doing this anymore. I don't really think you can do this anymore. Those debris cautions to re-rack the field, to make it more interesting at the end of the race, especially with gambling in the sport. Tony Stewart talked about this on the Kenny Conversation a couple years ago. You can't do any type of judging by the hip or internal, let's say, moderating. And what I mean by that is Tony Stewart and Kenny Wallace talked about the fact that back in the day, if you pissed NASCAR off, if you said something in the media they didn't like, they could give you a pit road speeding penalty the next week. And that was NASCAR's way of basically governing, right? You really can't do that. You can't do that now that you have legalized sports gambling and all of these leagues and what now tracks, they're essentially in bed with the gambling companies, which is fine. But you can't have people who put a ton of money on the line thinking that a sports league is basically re-racking the field at the end just to make it interesting. And I did find this very fascinating. And Carl Edwards said after the season, I think he said he went down to Key West by himself to kind of figure out what he wanted to do. And he was driving and he went to Joe Gibbs Racing to basically tell Joe Gibbs his decision. And I did think the way he framed this was really, really interesting. He basically said that he was so devoted to racing that he put his heart, his soul, his mind, his body into it. And he's thinking, and at the time, what is he? Is he 30? I don't even know, 36, 37, whatever. We'll look it up. Something like that. But he's thinking to himself, and also he's talking to Dale Jr. about this, with Dale Jr. having his head injuries and all that. And Carl Edwards said, he hadn't had necessarily the injuries like that, the concussions, but he had gotten his bell rung and he was starting to think more about that. Dale Jr. brought that to the attention of a lot of folks. But I found this part really, really interesting. He's thinking, okay, I just finished up a year of NASCAR. And he's thinking, if I'm going to do this again, I'm going to do one full year where I put my entire life into this, right? I don't see my wife as much. I don't see my kids as much. I'm gone all the time. I'm traveling every single week. Obviously, well paid. We all know that. You get the fame, you get all that. But he's thinking to himself, and he said this. He said, am I going to go through another year of this, knowing it's probably going to come down to that final 2 laps, right? That final caution in Homestead. You're going to do everything all year long, all season long. Whether you have a great season, whether you have a bad season, but if you're in the playoffs, if you're in the championship hunt, he's thinking to himself, am I going to put myself through all of this, knowing that NASCAR is probably going to do the same thing and throw that late caution, and it's all going to come down to a final restart? And I thought that really, really put the whole thing in perspective, right? To go through all of that. You could be great, right? All the trials and tribulations, 36 races. You get to the 36th race, and it's going to come down to a final restart. And I just thought that part was really, really interesting. Again, if you guys haven't watched this, if you haven't listened to it, I can't recommend it enough. Just a 2-hour therapy session between buddies. And look, they talked about that. That was the most interesting part to me. And also Dale Jr. asked him, look, have you had more opportunities? Of course, all kinds of great teams have contacted Carl Edwards over the years, and he has not run a race. He didn't totally rule that out. I think we're going to see Carl Edwards run a race. Maybe it's an Xfinity race. And I don't know, this year, next year, whatever. I could see Carl Edwards running one more race or a couple more. Who knows? But he's doing TV now, going to be doing TV with Dale Earnhardt Jr. with the new package there with what? Is it Amazon? And so just a really fascinating interview from what he's been doing since then, talking about how he's rekindled his relationship with his kids, didn't know his kids very much. He went on this boating adventure where he went and bought a boat over there in Europe and drove the boat back with his son. And he told this really great story where they were traveling and he said he just needed to get a workout in. He went out to the dock doing burpees or whatever. And he said his cell phone fell into the water. And he said his son said something like, well, good, Dad, because now you'll pay attention to me. And he said that hit him really hard. He said once he was gone from the sport that first year or whatever it was, he said there was a time where in the morning, his son, they ran into the room of he and his wife's room, and the son jumped on his side, into his side of the bed, which is something that never happened. And he turns and looks at his wife, and she says, this is what you've been missing. Just a really fascinating conversation. You know, doesn't regret it. And I'm sure he said, look, that first year or two, really, really difficult. He said there was a time where his wife wanted to watch a race and watched a couple laps. He watched a couple laps and just couldn't do it anymore. And he said he went out and about, and people would say, hey, how's your season going? And he said, well, I'm not racing anymore. And they're like, what the heck are you talking about? Because I get that too, especially if you're an athlete at that level, the highest level in motorsports, that becomes your whole identity is being a racer. Want to thank you guys for watching here. We got a bunch of people in. We got some comments and questions. I will get to those as well. Let's see. Jerry Langston says, because they stole his win. Talking about that championship. Yeah. Jerry Langston, don't blame him. Championships are hard to come by, especially when NASCAR sticks it to you with no lube. That's what Jerry Langston is saying. Yeah. When I was listening to this too, I will say again, you know, it does stink that NASCAR did this back in the day. And again, we're rehashing this, but that's what we do when you have a big interview like this. It is a damn shame, because I think most people agree that Carl Edwards was royally screwed back in the day. And Carl also talked about the first championship that he missed out on, where he tied Tony Stewart. So you're down to a tie, but you lose by that much. But you didn't have, you know, Dale Jr. used the word shenanigans. You didn't have the shenanigans with that first attempt to win the championship. Of course, it's going to be heartbreaking when you get down to literally a tie, essentially, and you lose to Tony Stewart. But the way he lost the championship at the end, when he's ending up retiring there, that is a bitter pill to swallow. And again, 8-9 years later, I don't want to say he's over it. You're probably never truly over that, but time heals all wounds. You move on. He's back in the good graces of the sport, which I think is fantastic. I remember we had a Rick Mast show, and I was talking to Rick Mast about this when Carl Edwards was going to get in the Hall of Fame. And to me, I remember we were kind of debating and arguing, because he didn't like the fact that Carl Edwards made all the money in the sport, left the sport, right? Kind of didn't have anything to do with NASCAR for the last 8 years or so. And maybe it's because I'm just somebody who I'm always looking for stories, interesting stories. I think the way Carl Edwards left made his story more interesting, right? He's a great driver. He's pissed. He retires out of nowhere and just goes off the grid. And essentially, nobody hears from him, right? There was some funny jokes at the beginning of the podcast on the Dirty Mo Media Dale Jr. download. And Dale Jr.'s messing with him. He's like, you know, do you have a bunker? He's like, do you have a supply of food that would last you, whatever it is? Joking, obviously. There's all these rumors about Carl Edwards of what the hell was he doing, right? Did he build some type of bomb shelter? Is he preparing for the apocalypse? Which he's not. He did say he has like a supply of food that would last him a little bit, but so did Dale Jr. So just some kind of funny moments from that podcast there. Another cool story, and I had heard this, but they hadn't talked about it together, obviously, because Carl Edwards hadn't talked with anybody. But the famous story that Dale Jr. has told a million times, hanging out with Kenny Schrader, going to the strip club back in the day when Jr. was like 15 or so. So what is that, like 35 years ago? So the story goes, Dale Jr. can't get in the strip club, so he has to sit outside on the truck, and he sits with this guy. And Dale Earnhardt Jr. did not know until I think it was essentially the end of Carl Edwards' career. Dale Earnhardt Jr. did not know that the man he sat with on that truck while everybody else was in the strip club having fun, so Dale Jr. is sitting there and drinking beer, that was Carl Edwards' dad, which is really, really fascinating. And Dale Jr. said, man, I wish I would have known that when we were driving. He just said, our relationship or friendship, he thought would have been so impacted by knowing that dude that sat with him on the truck 35 years ago was Carl Edwards' dad. And I just thought that was a really cool story. Obviously, if you don't know, I think most of you do, but Carl Edwards, cousins with Ken Schrader. I think they're cousins first removed. So they were hanging out back in the day. Like I said, this was like 35 years ago. It's funny because I was in Ken Schrader's shop. I was in his shop quite a bit. I would say, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times when we first started recording this Herman Schrader before we got all the gear and whatnot, so he could do it himself from the shop. But I remember it, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this actually. You probably can't. You'd have to really zoom in. But if you see where Schrader is sitting in the office of his shop, he's got kind of like a bulletin board in the background. So you probably can't see it. It's probably too small, and depending on where he's sitting. But on that bulletin board is that famous business card. You've probably seen the story where when Carl Edwards was, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, as he's trying to get a NASCAR ride, he passed out these business cards with his picture on it, and it said something like, if you're looking for a driver, you're looking for me. Or if you're looking for a driver, you're looking for Carl Edwards. And so that actual business card, because again, Schrader and Carl Edwards are cousins, that's sitting there on the bulletin board in Ken Schrader's shop, which is pretty sweet. And there's a lot of Missouri connections here because Schrader's shop, gosh, what town is it in? I can't remember. I've been there. I live in basically St. Louis. Not the city, but like 15 minutes from downtown. Schrader lives about 40 minutes from me. Carl Edwards lives in Columbia, where University of Missouri is. That's a good 2 hours from St. Louis. And just because we're talking about Missouri connections, Kenny Wallace had Jamie McMurray on Kenny Conversations, and that already dropped this morning on Dirty Mo Media Podcast, and it's going to drop here on YouTube later tonight. Really good conversation. I just bring that up because I'm talking about Missouri connections. All right, I'll get back here and check out some of your comments. I'm not going to go super long on this. Let's see. Bibster's Repair Shop says, just finished listening to the podcast. Really excited to see Carl back at the track. Jerry Langston saying NASCAR been making paper champions, talking about the controversy with Edwards. And maybe he's also talking about the playoff situation. I know a lot of old school NASCAR fans don't love necessarily the playoff format, taking away from the regular season and all that. Good Time says, I don't believe it should come down to one race or one restart. I don't either. And that's where I think NASCAR needs to continue. I shouldn't say tweak, because NASCAR said they didn't want to tweak the format every year, right? If they're going to make a change, they're going to make it more substantial, which is why they didn't really make any changes this year, but potentially down the road. I think whether it's a couple races at the end, I do think one thing that you can do that's easy is rotate the final race. Now, that doesn't take away from it coming down to one race, but I do think that takes away from a particular manufacturer that just happens to have it figured out, like it has been for Penske in the last several years with Phoenix. I would rotate. What do you guys think? I would rotate Phoenix, Las Vegas. Would you do Homestead? You can't do Atlanta because there's too much with a super speedway. I think luck involved, obviously. So you're not going to do Atlanta. What am I missing there for the final 3 races? What do you think if you did a rotation of 3? You think that's fair? If you go Phoenix, Vegas, Homestead, what do you guys think on that? Let's see. Jerry Langston says, I see you wanting to giggle, LOL. I'm just brutally honest. I appreciate that. I appreciated the honesty from Carl Edwards. I think he was fair in his criticism, but he wasn't biting in his criticism. And I get that because he's a dude who, look, it was 8-9 years ago. He's just now getting into the good graces of NASCAR. He doesn't want to absolutely rip them, even though deep down, he was being much nicer than he actually feels. Let's be honest. And this is why I'll say it again. At one point in the interview with Dale Earnhardt Jr., he said, I'm kind of wondering how honest I want to be. And that tells you right there all you need to know. And again, he did say flat out, he thought the championship was snatched from him. And he said, look, we know it's a fact. And he's talked to NASCAR people who admitted they were throwing those cautions back in the day to re-rack the field, to make it more entertaining for the TV ratings and all that. But he also said, look, he understood that to a certain extent because they are in the entertainment business, right? Even if he didn't like it. And I think most people would agree, though. This was the most egregious time where people really thought it was truly, truly unfair and that NASCAR was going out of their way. Well, I shouldn't say that. Knowingly or unknowingly, they clearly impacted a championship that season. I'm not saying that's what they wanted the end result to be. I'm not trying to say it's this grand conspiracy theory, but what they did in re-racking the field with that, as people call it, fake caution, it did impact the championship. And look, Kenny Wallace said this, was it 3 years ago? Right? I mean, he said that Carl Edwards left NASCAR with a broken heart. And that video was actually popping a little bit yesterday. That's still our biggest video on YouTube. It was, I think, maybe May or June of 3 years ago. So not quite 3 years ago. And that video is pushing, it's not that close to 1 million views, but it's over 900. I think it's like 930,000 views. That's still our most popular video on this channel. That just goes to show you too of just the mystery, the mystique, the intrigue that people had for Carl Edwards over the last 8 years or so. But then really, as he's coming back, he's doing media, he's doing interviews now, he's going to do TV, which, by the way, I think he's going to be absolutely fantastic at TV. I think he's going to be really, really good. And also, if you're a dude who has all the money in the world, right? You do other things, you want to be around your family, but now you can also bring your family to the tracks. I think he's is he doing 5 races? And to me, if you're somebody who doesn't have to work, but you still want to be involved in the sport, isn't this 5 race deal, whatever they're doing with Amazon, isn't that the perfect way to jump back in? You don't have to do every race. You don't have to travel 35, 40 weeks a year. You can do 5 races, have fun. And hey, if you love it, maybe you want to do a little more work next year, right? Okay. Let's see. Full Throttle RP says, I cried watching and understanding how he was screwed over on his championship. Very sad. Let's see. Gib Salisbury says, it's ridiculous that a candy wrapper on the track will cause a caution. Right. And this is what was going on back in the day. Obviously, you can't do that anymore. Although there's still a lot of discussion about NASCAR throwing cautions. This was more so at Daytona, the Daytona weekend, but this is for safety, right? It's more about, and I understand how fans, they want to see folks race to the checkered flag. But also, look, if you don't throw the caution, all of a sudden guys are flying through and there's still cars trying to get out of the way, and then you have the cool down lap, you could have some really terrible outcomes from that as well if you don't throw a caution. NASCAR is in a really, really tough spot there when they have to make an absolutely split-second decision on the final lap most of the time, right? And people aren't going to be happy. You want to have the best possible finish. You want to have the most fair finish, but also at the end of the day, the driver's safety is the number one concern. Dave Milam says, nicely done. Good job. And Manga 12 says, sometimes the cautions are excessive for sure. Steve D says, Dale gets the best interviews. He does. But it's not just Dale getting the best interviews, right? Dale does a really good job when he's interviewing these folks. And I'll just be honest with you. Now that I'm kind of full-time in the NASCAR world, I try to consume as much as possible. But I will say I don't listen to as many of the real long-form interviews as I should. If I'm on a car trip, if I'm by myself, like I remember I had a car trip by myself and I listened to the Scott Bloomquist interview with Dale Jr. and Mike Davis. This was what last year, right after Scott Bloomquist passed away. But I consume most of the Dirty Mo Media stuff from the clips right on social media. For me, usually X or on YouTube. But if there's an interview that like this was the interview, right? And Dale Jr. said that this was the interview, Carl Edwards, that everybody had been clamoring for years, and they finally did it, and they did it right, even though it was a remote deal, right? Carl Edwards was in Columbia, and Dale Jr. was wherever he's at. He wasn't in studio, but it was really well done. It was the right length of time. Again, it was with the ads and all that. It was almost 2 hours long, so you felt like every question that needed to be asked for this first interview, right? This first big interview. Obviously, you have to get out of the way. Not even get out of the way. It's what people want to hear and see. You have to talk about Carl Edwards leaving the sport. I mean, that's the number one story. But they hit on so many different things over the course of the almost 2 hours. But yeah, Dale Jr. gets the best interviews, but he's also a really good interviewer. It just felt like two buddies, and it was a therapy session, and they kind of challenged each other if they didn't like a certain answer. I remember at one point, after Carl initially described what happened, and he said it was kind of like God's plan type deal. And I'm paraphrasing, but Dale Jr. challenged him saying, I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can believe that. I don't know. And he wasn't saying you're lying, but he's saying like, give me more. We got to get into this more. I don't think you can just say 8-9 years later that this was God's plan. Like we got to talk about how you were really feeling, your emotions back then. And then also now, 8-9 years later. Let's see what we got here. A lot of comments coming in. David Carter says, this was one of the most moving, interesting interviews I've ever seen Dale Earnhardt. I enjoyed every second of it. I've always been a Carl Edwards fan. Yeah, I think it's my favorite. It might be, I shouldn't say my favorite because I got to say Kenny Wallace's interviews are my favorite. But in terms of the Dale Jr. download, any content that I've heard from them, and they've done all kinds of fantastic stuff. I think this was the best interview I ever heard. NASCAR related, honestly. But it's also because, look, Dale's a great interviewer. He got Carl Edwards, right? He was the first guy to get Carl Edwards, and everything was on the table. And Carl Edwards sat down there and for 90 minutes, 100 minutes, whatever it was, really kind of poured his heart out, but also just explained detail by detail all of his decision making. When I say all, I say most. I still think deep down he probably has a lot of anger. Surely had a lot more back in the day, but he didn't want to absolutely destroy NASCAR. But I'm sure there's some things he held back. And look, that's how we all would be, right? If we felt we were royally screwed, or in his words, that the championship was snatched from him. Let's see. We got Matthew McDonald says the DJD Dale Jr. download interviews are awesome. Also, the Stapleton 42 hometown history vids. Yeah, Mitch Stapleton's great. Are great too. Would be great if Dirty Mo Media and Mitch Logan could do a collab. Yeah, but they're also doing their own thing, man. They're both super successful doing their own thing. So sometimes you don't mess with that. Also, let's see. Denver Thurston says, can NASCAR give Carl Edwards Daytona 500 start as a way to send him off grand style with him some sense of pride back that lost when left the sport? Okay, first of all, we need to type that better. All due respect, okay? We need to add some words there, Denver. But look, there's no way, because Carl Edwards was talking about his health. His wife's a doctor, right? If Carl Edwards does do a one-off race, which I wouldn't rule out, there ain't no way in hell he's doing a super speedway, right? There's no way he's doing the Daytona 500. He'll do something shorter because, again, talking about injuries and anything can happen at a super speedway. The worst we know could happen at a super speedway. So if Carl Edwards does a one-off race, I would almost guarantee you there's no chance it's at a super speedway. Dale Jr. brought up Bristol, so maybe someplace like that. All right. We're over 30 minutes. I'm going to shut it down. Thank you so much, you guys. Just want to give my comments on the interview. I thought it was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll go to Steve B here at the end. I think Carl's only passion now is sailing, to be honest. Right. So Carl Edwards talked about sailing, boating, whatever you want to call it, a lot at the beginning of that interview. And Sean Murphy says it was a great interview. Yes, it was. All right. Thank you very much, guys. Comment, like, subscribe. If you haven't checked it out, Dale Jr. Download with Carl Edwards. I highly recommend it on podcast or here on YouTube as well. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. Love you all. Thanks. We'll see you soon here on the Kenny Wallace YouTube channel and Kenny Wallace Media. Charlie Marlow signing off.